Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2-3 review. We have a number of readings, starting with The Last Americans, Environmental Collapse and the End of Civilization. As I said, it sounds a bit apocalyptic, but Diamond does a great job of outlining the ways that past civilizations have collapsed. And of course, what he's trying to do is outline a pattern of unsustainable behaviors. What's really interesting about all this, I'm sure you found this interesting too, is he's mainly focused on resource use. He's not really focused on social justice and inequality, but what he's focused on that's close to this is political systems and leaders with short-term interests that failed to identify or simply didn't care enough about the markers to come up with a long-term vision, a long-term sustainable vision. And so we're not in the land of social justice, but we're in the land of politics, something closely related, of course, right? But mainly we're interested in resource use. What I loved about this when I reread it, it actually opens with a poem. It's perfect for our course on literature, isn't it? And so this is Ozymandias, a very famous poem by the Romantic poet Shelley, who was writing at the same time as Wordsworth, if you're wondering when this poem was written. So late 18th century. And as you read it, it's about a king who basically says this is, so the scene is that we're in the desert. There's just this old used up statue there, right? And on the inscription on the statue says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." So there was this great kingdom there once, but now nothing remains, right? All that is there, and this is a nice ecological reading. The lone and level sands stretch far away, so it turned back into desert despite being a mighty civilization once, which is perfect for this essay on collapse. And we'll come back and we'll give this actually a sustainability reading based upon what we learned from Diamond to conclude this video. So what I want to do is just go through the basic points, make sure you've got them. Remember that what we're doing with this, it is not literature, but rather we're learning how we can read literature for sustainability. So this is another one of those readings, much like Merchant or the Sheath's reading on pastoralism from our first module, or the Sturgeon reading, the very first reading on defining people as natural. This is another one of those readings. We're pulling ideas that we will then apply to readings in the next module, and of course, and on the novel that we'll read at the end of the course for the final exam as well. All right, so let's get into it. Basically, we're looking at the reasons that societies collapse, but more importantly, why do leaders or societies sometimes miss the warning signs or ignore them? Of course, we can flip all of this into the positive. What should societies do to remain sustainable? And we could ask, is the U.S. doing that? Are they avoiding the bad things or doing the right things that are implied? So we'll want to read it both ways. But either way, we have the criterion. So I'm just going to walk you through the page numbers. So in 182, he just kind of sets things up and says, most of these societies had a destruction of required resources, and there's a pretty steep curve of decline. Now, we could look at the regions of the earth, and he does talk about this. The U.S. isn't in such bad shape right now, but other areas of the planet are. And his argument later is that we can no longer, the U.S. and other countries, can no longer just think of those areas as separate. Their climate problems cause political problems. Those political problems cause problems for the U.S. And that we've got our economic system is interrupted, agriculture is interrupted. There's potentially war, right? Terrorism, all these different things that come from these areas that don't have a functional ecosystem, where there's just not enough food and water for everyone. Resource shortages turn ugly, as we all know, and that is politically ugly in this case. So we're all connected in our modern age. So that is something that's different, of course, than the past when a civilization failed, but one continent over, nobody even knew that civilization ever existed, right? But times are changing, right? And so our modern global area means we're all connected and have to worry about what's going on in other ecosystems on the other side of the world as well. So he gets into problematic cultural attitudes. Those in power did not perceive or resolve the crisis. He says that's a familiar problem today. Here's one easy example. President Trump, a climate change denier, says, I don't believe it. That the climate change report that he's commenting on says that things are getting bad and that we're on track to change the world pretty quickly. And this is actually a report from the U.S. government, right? And so you could see that oftentimes we are in denial. This is not a thing of the past, but it is a thing of the present as well. If we want to move on to the next part of this, the cultural attitudes, Diamond points out that oftentimes politically this is just perceived, that is, the environmental and climate crises are perceived as just one issue among many. In the US, that might be issues of healthcare. It could be issues of women's rights or the abortion debate. And that all of these things oftentimes are more important in the media and on voters' minds than a functional ecosystem. And Diamond says, big picture, that's probably not good because we depend for our survival on the ecosystems, and the other issues are human-caused issues, are more intellectual issues, legal issues. But sometimes, because we're an advanced society, the ecosystem gets pushed to the back, and we don't pay attention to it. All right, so other misconceptions that we could turn into conceptions for reading, and either positive or negative elements of a sustainable society inside of a reading. We must balance the environment against human needs. This is the misconception. He says it's actually just the opposite. We're linked in chains of cause and effect, as we all know. But we have to fit human needs into a functional ecosystem. And if we're doing that, we're sustainable. We all know that, right? But that's one thing that he brings up. We can trust in technology to solve our problems. We know this from the first module. But Diamond teaches us a bit more. It is the progress and recovery narrative. I hope you recognize it as that. So there's our connection across modules, a major theme in how we think about the environment. But he says technology can take years to implement. So it's not a quick solution. There are no quick solutions. We might overestimate the positive impact. And it has unforeseen negative, that is, technology has unforeseen negative side effects. We could use carbon capture technology, but we don't know what type of pollution it may cause, or how it may change the atmospheric balance in some way by removing all that carbon, perhaps quickly if we could, right? We're not really sure what's going to happen there. So these can be problems too. Now, this is the type of thing that you could read into later stories and the novel at the end of the course. What is the belief in technology solving problems? Let's say we're reading The Water Knife, a novel that is often read at the end of this course. That means we could take a look at technology. Do people believe that technology is going to save them? Does the story comment on how technology was there, but it took too long and didn't work, and that caused more water problems? Did they overestimate how easy it would be for technology, hydro engineering, so to speak, to save them, and they overestimated its worth? These are all ways that you can judge and evaluate the mistakes of characters or scenes and settings inside of novels, right? Maybe there was negative side effects when they tried certain ways of getting water in The Water Knife where there's a water shortage. So you can see how this very easily turns into a way to judge literature and, of course, to judge the world, which is what Diamond is interested in. All right, misconception number 3. Environmentalists are fear-mongering, overreacting extremists. We could look for that. I would just say this. It breaks the first rule of argument. This is nothing from Diamond, but the first rule of argument is that you don't attack the person. You discuss the issue. You debate the values and the strategies and whether or not they'll solve the problem. You don't attack the person. Now, we probably know in our society, oftentimes this happens even inside of political debates. I showed you President Trump a moment ago, and he became president for that type of debate style, not debating the issues, but oftentimes just attacking and belittling the person. And it seems to have worked well enough that many Americans voted him into the presidency, right? But in a perfect world, or at least the academic world, it doesn't matter who's speaking. What we want to do is focus on issues and actually solving the world's problems. Right? So Diamond says the developed world doesn't have major problems with food, clean water, agriculture yet, but other parts do. As I mentioned, and as Diamond mentions, everything is interconnected though. So the major takeaway, environmentally stressed, this is the later in the essay, around page 184 to 189-ish maybe. Environmentally stressed, overpopulated countries are also the trouble spots in the world, right? State governments that collapse, or they have recent civil wars, they're creating problems for even rich and developed countries. And so these places with non-functional ecosystems have civil wars, have weak governments because people are battling for resources. The government uses all of the resources for people who support them, leaving other citizens without, right? Developed countries have to defend borders against immigrants, against terrorists. They have to send military assistance, right? This probably sounds like what the United States is doing. So you can see the United States military is in some ways indirectly responding not to just war and terrorism, but to to ecosystem problems, to environmental problems, right? And so this is what happens. So there's a big connection to the geopolitical world. All right, one last misconception we might talk about here. The United States is too modern to collapse. The primitive societies did, but we have our technology and our know-how, and we'll get ourselves out of this somehow. But the problem of all collapsed societies that we could look at and see if this is happening in the U.S., depleting forests, eroding topsoil, building cities in areas with no water. This is the theme of the water knife that you'll likely read to end the course. And of course, we can think of cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix and real cities in the United States, as well as around the world, these giant, giant cities that don't have a lot of water. So these type of things will catch up to everyone eventually, even the most modern of cities. If you pay attention to the Southwest United States at all, you do know that there are water shortages. You might be familiar with California's water shortage. There's sort of a war between industry, which needs a lot of water, and people wanting water. There's also a war between the rich who can afford lots of water in California, and we're paying the $1,000 fines for excessive water usage because they wanted green lawns, versus other people who are just trying to get water to drink, right, in California in the current day, right? And so you can see these type of things sort of balloon out in short-term interest, sometimes like having a green lawn overtakes the long-term interest of making sure everyone has enough water. That point itself takes us down to our next reading, which we won't talk about quite yet, but is water a human right? Right? And so we get down there. I think what I'd like to do at the last few minutes is actually walk through the Diamond essay and apply it to a few things we've read before. Work from here. I rounded up in my notes what I might come up with treat as a list of sustainable ways of reading literature. Here's some problems that come up later in the essay. It's hard to recognize a slow trend. Sometimes people just don't see it. Scientists don't see it. Citizens don't see it. Politicians don't see it. So we're sort of invisible to slow changes, right? And so that's just a human flaw that we have. Nothing we can do about it, though, to some extent, right? If a problem is recognized, the short-term interests may clash with the long-term. That is, the economic interests of the United States mean that we're going to continue to plunder the environment too much, create greenhouse gases that will increase our climate change. So we can't fix climate change, which is the long-term thing, right? So the short-term over the long-term. Some pro-environmental or sustainable changes would clash with our own values. We all like to be comfortable. We all like to buy things. We all like to buy plastic things and dump them in the earth, right? Or whatever it may be. We all like to drive on vacations and fly places. But what does that do? That creates greenhouse emissions as well, right? So we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like to change our lifestyle, and that works against us as well. And then the other ways of reading can be found here, things that we talked about earlier, the different conceptions or misconceptions. Let's take a look now at Ozymandias and see which of these might apply to Ozymandias here. So we can just look through and say, all right, do we have evidence that it's hard to recognize a slow trend? We don't really see that in the poem, although that must have happened at some point as this king's kingdom disappeared and became the desert again. Short-term interests may clash with long-term. We can maybe see kind of that. He was interested in building sculptures of himself, right? We know that even from this little short poem. So there would be something of that there. He was interested in power and showing his power. And although I didn't round it up here, one of the criterion that Diamond brings up is that leaders are oftentimes interested in solidifying their own power, not making changes that might make people uncomfortable, right? And so we see a bit of 2 and 3 inside of here, that he was interested in power. We must balance the environment against human needs. It seems like the human needs were more important than the environment. One that I find really interesting, if we kind of work through all of these, unsustainable development happening in challenging ecosystems. Example, cities in the desert, like we talked about. This happens in the desert, right? So this is a civilization that was built in an unsustainable terrain. The ecosystem simply wouldn't support it. Now, that's not what the poem is about. I think what the poem wants us to see it as is that nature will always overtake human works. But if we want to push that a little bit farther, we can talk about that from the view of sustainability and start to apply some of these things, 1, 2, and 7 here that seem to come right out of the poem. And then we can give it a sustainability reading. And that's the focus of what we're doing right now. Thank you.